Good evening. I'm Alan Price. I'm director here at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and it's good to see you here. Many of you, I'm seeing you again, so welcome back. On behalf of my colleague, Stephen Rothstein at the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming this evening. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and Gourmet Catering, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Almost 40 years ago, President Carter spoke here at the dedication of this library. In his remarks, he noted that the library would serve as a place for the work of reflection and evaluation of what President Kennedy did. This evening, we are so pleased to have the opportunity to spend this time reflecting on the work of President Carter with our esteemed special guests. Stuart Eizenstat was President Carter's chief White House domestic policy advisor. He served President Clinton as ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce, Undersecretary of State, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and Special Representative of the President on Holocaust-era issues. In the Obama administration, he was Special Representative of the Secretary of State on Holocaust issues. He is now an international lawyer with Covington and Burling in Washington. He also has a terrific book out. It really is wonderful. Meredith Evans was appointed director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum, administered by the National Archives and Records Administration in November 2015. As director, she focuses on civic engagement, the role of the presidency and public policy, and making accessible the records of President Carter, his cabinet, and the White House administration. She has written on the role and value of museums, libraries, and archives, and has presented at various international and national conferences. Please join me in welcoming our special guests this evening.
Thank you very much, Alan. You know, it's typical for people to say when you see any audience that it's a special evening, but this really is a special evening for a variety of reasons. The first is my connection to Boston. I married my late wife of 45 years, Fran, who was a Boston native. We met at Harvard Law School, and I have the pleasure of having a number of my classmates and others that Ambassador Barry White and some of my colleagues have come for. It is also special because, and I hope she's here, one of the people who was instrumental in my Holocaust work during the Clinton administration, where I negotiated $8 billion of recoveries, and she was really the heroine for the Swiss bank negotiations. She's really the one that pioneered it, Greta Beer, and got me very much involved in it. It's also special to have Dr. Meredith Evans here because of the Carter Center connection that I obviously have. But most pertinent to tonight is this library itself. For one thing, I can say without qualification that my inspiration for public service came from a 1962 speech which President Kennedy gave at Keenan Football Stadium at Chapel Hill, at the University of North Carolina. And he urged all of us to try to serve our country and the world and make it a better place. And without question, that was really the catalyst for my public career. Like so many in my generation, I'm sure I'm speaking for others, I remember exactly where I was to the minute when the assassination occurred in Chapel Hill, the Political Science Department. And I drove up from Chapel Hill overnight to be at the U.S. Capitol when his body was brought from the White House to the Capitol. And as Alan said, on October 20th, 1979, President Carter, who was not a great speech maker, gave a great speech here at the opening. May I say, not because I helped write it, but because of the emotion behind it. And it was emotional for a variety of reasons, both because of his drawing inspiration from President Kennedy, but also because it came about 2 weeks before the announcement by Ted that he was running against us. So we've always remembered that, and we'll talk more about that later. Jimmy Carter's political hero was Harry Truman. And he placed his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," on his Oval Office desk in a plaque. Both presidents left the White House highly unpopular. Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements than for his failures. And I'm hopeful that my book has a similar impact on a reassessment of Jimmy Carter as president, not just as the most admired and, as we were talking about, the longest serving former president. Almost 70% of all our major legislation was passed by Congress, just under the percent of the first president I served in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, after Harvard Law School. He honored the presidency. He respected the institutions of government, the press, even when it was brutally difficult on him, because he realized it had an important role in a free society. The FBI, the Justice Department. Walter Mondale, his vice president, put it very succinctly in words that are on the Carter Center Foundation. We honored the law, we kept the peace, and we told the truth. Now, the wrap on the Carter presidency is summarized in my book by what I call, and excuse my southern accent, 4 I's: inflation, Iran, inexperience by the president and his so-called Georgia Mafia, of whom I was one. I was the experienced guy, having worked a year in the Johnson White House. And inter-party warfare with the liberal wing of the party led by Ted Kennedy. We'll talk about that more in a moment. The problem is these are very real liabilities. I'm totally candid about them. It's the reason why the New York Times and Washington Post and many other publications have given us a very good review, because it's not just an insider's view, it's an honest view of his mistakes and failures, including my own as advisor. This is not a book that could have been entitled "If He'd Only Listened to Me." But also his achievements, which have been so obscured by these problems. Achievements at home and abroad, which are of lasting import to us this day. And I wanted to write the book while there were still living eyewitnesses, and before history's verdict that Jimmy Carter was a failed president was so indelibly emblazoned in people's minds that that would be the long and short of the 39th President of the United States. One of the unique features about the book is based on a habit I had from University of North Carolina. I took it into Harvard Law School and then into the White House, and that was being an inveterate note-taker. And this book is based on over 5,000 pages of contemporaneous verbatim notes of everything I heard, everything I saw, everything I observed, every meeting that I was in. They're in the National Archives and the Carter Library and then the Library of Congress. And I augmented that with 350 interviews, 5 of the president himself. But I was not selective. I interviewed Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, detractors and supporters, so that I could give a complete and candid assessment of the Carter presidency. To understand the Carter presidency, you have to understand the 1970s in which we governed. It was a decade of profound, indeed epic change in several ways. It was the decade in which we suffered our first loss in a foreign war in Vietnam, in which there was urban violence throughout our major cities. I remember being on the portico of the Johnson White House seeing 16th Street burn. And it was a decade of a new economic phenomenon that even Harvard economists couldn't give a name to, so they called it the ugly name of stagflation, something we had never had before and never since: simultaneous slow growth and high inflation. Sort of contradiction of the Phillips curve. It was a decade in which a whole set of new social movements, which we take for granted today, burst onto the scene. The environmental movement, the consumer movement, the Black Power movement that morphed in now into Black Lives Matter, the women's rights movement, now #MeToo, and after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973 on abortion, the Right to Life movement. It was a decade in which a new political force, which is very much with us in 2019, was brought onto the scene by Reverend Jerry Falwell, a conservative Baptist minister from Virginia, who catalyzed the evangelical movement into a political force. He called Carter, who was probably the most religious president we've had in American history, not a real Baptist who was harboring homosexuals on his staff. And Ronald Reagan very adroitly merged that evangelical movement to Richard Nixon's silent majority of dissatisfied blue-collar workers in the Midwest into a winning coalition in 1980. That's precisely the political coalition of Donald J. Trump to this day. Abroad, it was also a decade of epic change. We were in the midst of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was at its most aggressive. Enormous buildups of military spending in the air, on the ground, and on the sea. Encouraging, funding, and supporting Cuban proxy troops for communist revolutions in the Horn of Africa, Angola, Namibia. Ultimately, as I'll discuss a little later, invading Afghanistan, the first invasion of a country directly since World War II, and even supporting Euro-communist movements with some success in Western Europe, particularly in Italy. It was a decade in which a new major force came onto the scene, tiptoeing at that time, now in full force, the People's Republic of China. More on that also in a minute. It was a decade in which a Polish-born priest became Pope John Paul II and gave hope, along with Carter's Human Rights Campaign, to those living behind the Iron Curtain. And it was a decade in which a revolution occurred, which is front page news to this day and bedevils us to this day, and that is the radical Islamic revolution of Iran. So let me briefly take you through a few domestic achievements which are totally unrecognized. The energy security we enjoy today, the lack of dependence on OPEC imported foreign oil, which was over 50% when we took office and growing by leaps and bounds every month, owes much to the foundation that President Carter laid with 3 major energy bills in 4 years, which did everything from ending price controls on natural gas and crude oil to encourage domestic production, which had been stalled because of the limited price that could be gone. This year, 2019, the United States of America will be the #1 producer of energy in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia. We put conservation at the center of our energy policy, the first fuel economy standards, the first insulation standards, and we inaugurated, and I have a picture of it in the book, the solar era of clean energy, as Carter put a solar panel on the White House symbolically. It was then taken down by Reagan in the first weeks, but he couldn't take down the solar movement, which is now 10% of our total electricity. Carter was also a great consumer champion. Seemed odd, perhaps, for a small businessman from the South. He appointed consumer advocates to regulate industries, some even from Ralph Nader's organizations, not as today, appointing people who come from or were lobbyists for the industries they're supposed to regulate. And we married that to transformative deregulation of all modes of transportation to bring to consumers more competition and lower prices for buses, for rail, for trucking, and most relevant to us as consumers, airlines. We would not have the Southwests and JetBlues, the efficiency of the UPS and FedEx air cargoes had we not removed the shackles which prevented new carriers from coming in and competing. We democratized air travel for the middle class. That might not seem too great if you're sitting in seat 36E in the economy class and you're squeezed and hoping just to get a drink of water. But the fact is, we opened air travel to the middle class, and we didn't stop there. We went on to begin the deregulation of telecommunications and inaugurated the cable era. And for those of you who are aficionados of local craft beers, we ended even the Prohibition era restriction which prevented their flow. In addition, Carter was without question the greatest environmental president in American history, even more than Theodore Roosevelt. We doubled the size of Theodore Roosevelt's national park system with the Alaska Lands Bill over the fierce opposition of the Alaska delegation, which wanted the whole state open for oil and gas exploration. And in typical sort of Carter detail, he took a giant map of the state, laid it on the Oval Office rug, got on his hands and knees with Senator Ted Stevens, the 25-year veteran conservative Republican senator from Alaska, and showed him exactly what was going to be in the park and not available for exploration, what would be. And Stevens told us afterward he was amazed that, having represented the state for a quarter of a century, Carter knew more about it than he did. We were elected in '76 against Ford in significant part as a reaction to Watergate. Carter talked about a government as good as its people, I'll never lie to you. And that very much resonated. But this was not just campaign rhetoric. Every single piece of ethics legislation in force today in an ethically challenged Washington came from his vision and was signed into law with his pen. The 1978 Ethics Act, for example, for the first time required senior officials going into government to disclose their assets and potential conflicts of interest. It limited your ability to take gifts, then $25 while you were in office. It limited your ability to lobby the agencies you were with after you left office. Where did Robert Mueller come from? It came from the Office of Special Counsel we created to investigate wrongdoing. We can talk more about the differences between the two offices, but it was clearly the precursor. We put inspectors general into every single department to root out fraud, waste, and abuse, reformed the civil service system, had merit selection of judges by independent ABA-appointed people. Now, I got caught up unwittingly in the gift rule. And that is because a business magazine did a profile of me saying, not totally accurately, that I had a great love for the little 1-cent Tootsie Rolls that many of you may remember we grew up with. And so the Tootsie Roll company sent me a mammoth box of Tootsie Rolls. And I was not only salivating myself, but I knew I was going to be the hero to my young kids when I came home, only to find out from the ethics officer, he said, damned if I'm going to count every one of these Tootsie Rolls, but this box is so large it may be worth $25, you've got to return it. So I did, with a letter to the CEO thanking him and saying, you know, we're now living on a higher ethical plane. Sounds great, except a year or so later there's a profile done of the Tootsie Roll company, and the CEO says, Eizenstat tried to have it both ways. He sends us this high and mighty letter. We open the box, it's empty. So I'm still trying to find a Secret Service agent who stole my Tootsie Rolls. Now, more seriously, the first target, remarkably, of the new special counsel we created by legislation was none other than President Carter's own Chief of Staff, Hamilton Jordan, who was falsely accused by someone whose name may ring a bell, Roy Cohn, who was the hatchet man for Senator McCarthy and the early political advisor to Donald J. Trump. And he was representing the owners of a bar in New York called Studio 54. Hamilton should never have been in that bar, but they were being investigated for tax evasion, and as part of a plea bargain, he tried to get them to say that Hamilton was snorting cocaine, which he was not, in the bar. And a year later, and $1 million out of Ham's pocket, the grand jury 24-0 said totally untrue. But that's not the point. The point is that this happened for a year in our re-election year, in 1980, when Hamilton, who had been the genius behind our 76 campaign, was supposed to do the same thing in 1980. It's a total distraction. Not once did Carter call it a witch hunt, politically motivated. We believed in the rule of law, and we let it play out. I'll let you draw your own comparisons. Here's a Southern president from the deepest part of the Deep South who appoints more women, more minorities, more Jews to judgeships and to senior administration officials than all 38 presidents before him put together. Some of you may have seen the documentary RBG, or if not, she's mentioned in my book, and she said I would never have been on the Supreme Court had Jimmy Carter not opened judgeships to women and appointed me to the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. We supported affirmative action in admissions. Harvard's now facing that issue, of course, now. We saved New York City and Chrysler from bankruptcy, created the Department of Education. He was a great education president, and much, much more. With Walter Mondale as vice president, we took an office that was a constitutional afterthought. Any of you who have seen Hamilton know what I'm talking about. And we made it a real position. John Nance Garner, who was FDR's first vice president, said, it's not worth a bucket of warm spit, and I'm cleaning the language up for this audience. After we won the 76 election in the transition, Mondale sent Carter 10 requests to try to make something of this office. Access to all classified documents. You know that Harry Truman didn't know that there was an atomic bomb project until after FDR died. The ability to go into any meeting without notice, and one-on-one meetings with the president every week, just the two of them in the Oval Office. Carter not only checked everyone, he did everyone, and then added one that Mondale didn't even have the temerity to ask for. He moved the entire office of the vice president into the West Wing, just down the hallway from the Oval Office. And just like in real estate, where location is everything, it is in politics as well. It was a symbol that's true to this day with Pence and Trump, that the vice president really is now an engaged official. Now, our Achilles heel domestically was one of those four I's: inflation. I'm very candid about it. We inherited high inflation from Nixon and Ford, and it got worse. It got worse. And Carter called us in the summer of 1979, as we're starting to look at a re-election year, and he said, look, I've got a choice to make. I have tried everything to deal with this embedded inflation. I've had 2 anti-inflation czars. I've given 5 anti-inflation speeches. I've had voluntary wage and price guidelines. I've had to cut social spending to try to satisfy financial markets, and it's made me highly unpopular with the liberal wing. Nothing has worked. And so he said, I'm going to take the toughest medicine that the economy can take, even if it means, which it did, his re-election. He said, I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to be chairman of the Fed, knowing in advance, as I describe in a meeting in my book, just the 2 of them, exactly what Volcker was going to do. I mean, the contrast, it was sort of Mutt and Jeff, and Carter's about 5'9", and Volcker is 6'7", and a giant of an intellect as well. He'd been president of the Federal Reserve of New York. And he said to Carter exactly this: if you appoint me, I'm going to tighten the money supply. It's going to cause inflation to go up. It's going to cause unemployment to go up in the middle of your election. If you're not prepared to support me, don't appoint me. I don't want the job. I don't want you saying to me, just think of what poor Jerome Powell goes through when he raises interest rates 0.5%. Don't appoint me if you're going to point the finger at me and say it's Volcker that's responsible for the high interest rates. And Carter said, you take care of the interest rates and the economy, I'll take care of the politics. A number of us were very concerned about the appointment. And what Volcker did is why we have low inflation today, without question. You can ask Bernanke, you can ask Greenspan, you can ask any economist. Inflation dropped like a rock as a result of squeezing it out of the economy through high interest rates and high unemployment. It dropped like a rock at the end of Reagan's first year, not in time for our re-election. And it's emblematic that Carter put so many seeds down which blossomed only after he left office. So let's look at some of the accomplishments abroad, which in some respects are even more significant. The Camp David Accords and the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty are, in my opinion, the greatest act of presidential personal diplomacy in American history, more than Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. 13 agonizing days and nights. Carter personally drafts 22 separate peace agreements, and he has to negotiate separately with Prime Minister Begin of Israel and Sadat of Egypt because they were like 2 scorpions in a bottle. We put them together the first day, and it was a terrible scene. And then he added several personal touches. Studying these men, we got the CIA profiles, and he studied them to understand what made these 2 people tick. Where were their red lines? And so he adds 2 personal touches. The first Sunday of the 13 days, he takes them in his presidential limousine, Begin on his left, Sadat on his right, to the Gettysburg battlefield. And he did that because he wanted to drive home that 5 wars between Egypt and Israel were enough. Now, Sadat was a general. He had actually studied in some of our military institutions here. He knew all the problems that the South had at Gettysburg, Pickett's last charge and so forth, and started expounding on it, making it a little bit uncomfortable for Carter as the Southern president. But okay, Begin was anything but a general, but he was a Lincoln scholar, and on the spot, verbatim, he delivered Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It's really a very, very special event. But even with that, even with 22 drafts, we were close the last Sunday, the 13th day, when everybody agreed if we can't get it done, we've got to call it quits. And Begin comes to Carter and says, Mr. President, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. I've got an El Al plane waiting for me at Andrews Air Force Base. Get me a White House car to take me there. I'm out of here. Carter, realizing that that would collapse Sadat's historic trip to Jerusalem at great risk to himself when he pledged no more wars. It would inflame the Middle East and encourage the radicals like Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father. And it would engulf his own presidency. A total failure. He calls them in, by the way, over the objection of almost all of us, because we said it was too risky. And so he does one other personal touch, knowing that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. A picture had been taken, photo of the 3 of them. The first day at Camp David, he gets 8 copies, and the names of each of Begin's grandchildren, inscribes them to each with hopes for peace, best wishes, Jimmy Carter, delivers them to Begin at his cabin at Camp David, and sees Begin go through each of them, vocalize the names of each of the grandchildren. He sees Begin's lips quiver and his eyes tear. Begin puts his bags down and says, Mr. President, I'll make one last try. And that made Camp David possible, but that wasn't the end of it. Barry and other lawyers here, Camp David was an accord. It was a framework. It wasn't legally binding. It called for the treaty, and by the way, full autonomy for the Palestinians, it's another story, the treaty between Egypt and Israel within 3 months of the close of Camp David. 6 months passed, no treaty. So Carter, over literally, I'm not exaggerating, everybody's objection, decides to go to the region and do shuttle diplomacy between Cairo and Jerusalem to see if he can put the pieces together. 4 days of nonstop negotiations, and just like the last day at Camp David, we're close but not there, and literally everybody gave up. Air Force One is refueled, the airspace over Ben Gurion Airport is cleared, the top A's are already going from Jerusalem down to Tel Aviv, and Begin calls up and says, Mr. President, I'd like to see you once before you leave. And we thought, well, it's a courtesy to say thanks, but no thanks. And so he gets to the King David Hotel where the president was in the presidential suite and says, boys, because Carter called us down and said, look, we're not ready, Rosa and I have to get dressed, entertain the prime minister. And so we're bantering, and he says, now, boys, you know, this is a famous hotel, the King David. Oh, yes, sir, we know that. But not for the reasons you think. When I was head of the Irgun during the British Mandate, I blew this hotel up. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it until the president leaves. And he goes up to the presidential suite. That's where the treaty was finalized. They come down the elevator of this famous hotel, and the elevator breaks between floors. The Secret Service had to pull the 2 of them butt first down, and I call it the breech berth of the treaty.
You're taking all of my questions. I'm not going to have anything left.
Carter put human rights at the center of his foreign policy, not because it was a sort of dewy-eyed concept, because he wanted to compete with the Soviet Union and believed that the way to do it was to put the best of America's domestic values into our foreign policy. He applied it to the military dictators in Latin America, who were anti-communist, by the way, and pro-American, but very repressive, got thousands of prisoners released, catalyzed the new democratic movements there, which flowered in the 80s. and then created a new era in Latin American relations by marrying it to the Panama Canal, which was our toughest battle. Here's something you would never see in today's Washington. One of the heroes of the Panama Canal Treaty was the Republican minority leader, Howard Baker, a man of very small physical stature, but a great man of the Senate. And he did what he thought was right, even though he knew it would foreclose his getting the Republican nomination, and brings about a dozen Republicans along. And the most humorous of those who put us over the top, we needed a 2/3 number in the Senate, was Senator Hayakawa, a conservative Republican from California, who coined the phrase, "It's our canal, we stole it fair and square." Hardly a likely vote. So Mondale had worked with Hayakawa in the Senate, knew he had, even by Senate terms, a very high ego. He puts him on the phone with Carter, and Carter says, "What can I do to convince you to vote for the treaty?" And he said, "Don't talk to me about the treaty. You know what I think about it. But if you'll let me come every 2 weeks and share my wisdom with you, then I'll consider it." And Carter says, "Senator, only every 2 weeks? I wouldn't want to limit you to that." Flattered, he voted for the treaty, and Carter never saw him again. We also embraced human rights for the Soviet Union, applied it to their soft underbelly, championed the rights of Soviet Jewry, doubled the number of Soviet Jews who emigrated, and according to Natan Sharansky, the leader of the Soviet Jewish movement, later the head of the Jewish Agency and a cabinet minister, Carter saved his life, he said, by saying in the midst of his trial that he, in fact, was not a U.S. spy. And we applied hard power. This is maybe one of the biggest surprises in the book. Carter is somehow viewed as weak on defense. I assert in the book, backed up by a very new Pentagon study that's just come out, that all of the weapon systems that Reagan deployed, and I give him full credit for it, the MX missile and the cruise missile and the stealth bomber and so forth, intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe, Carter green-lighted. We reversed the post-Vietnam decline in spending, and his finest hour, even as conservative critics say, his finest hour was on Afghanistan. There's never an off minute in the White House. Christmas 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, put their own puppet on the throne, and Carter reacts with the Carter Doctrine, saying military force if you go any further. We put a grain embargo to stop any grain going to the Soviet Union 4 weeks before the Iowa caucuses, where they happen to grow a lot of grain. We put draft registration in for young people, hardly popular. We armed the Mujahideen, the opposition. And then in one of the most emotional things, Moscow Olympics were due in 1980. This was very important to their prestige, and we announced we were boycotting it. Just imagine, we get all the Olympians into the White House. These kids had trained for 4 years to go, and we have to tell them they can't. It was very tough. So, just one or two last things. China. Nixon and Kissinger deserve all the credit. We normalized relations with China, not Nixon, Ford, because of the Taiwan lobby. We were successful. Deng Xiaoping comes to the White House. I was in the cabinet room. All 4'11" of them. He says to the president, "Thank you for normalizing relations. What I really want is I want the lowest tariff levels you can give on your products." And he said, "I know there's a law, Jackson-Vanik, which precludes it for countries that bar immigration, but that's aimed at the Soviet Union. We don't. You write on this piece of paper," and he takes a little White House notepad and pencil, "write on here the number of Chinese you'd like us to give you each year. 1 million? 10 million? And Carter twinkles and says, "I'll tell you what, I'll take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists." Neither had to. So I'm going to conclude by talking about Iran, and then hopefully we'll get into Ted Kennedy and Carter's problems as a politician. But I want to conclude with Iran because it was the coup de grace that did end the administration. I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the Iranian Revolution, for the Shah's leaving. any more than it's fair to blame Eisenhower for the Cuban Revolution, 90 miles from our shore, or Obama for Mubarak being overthrown. But having said that, it's the worst intelligence failure in American history, in my opinion. The CIA had brought the king, the Shah, back on the throne as a 21-year-old. Every president had given him an open shopping list, and yet they didn't realize that his domestic support rested on quicksand, and that for 5 years he was getting secret treatments for cancer. The hostage crisis occurs, and here I'll double back to John Kennedy. I recommended, and this is one time I wish he had followed my advice, I advised a blockade of Iran's harbors to prevent the oil, which was their lifeline, from going out. And I cited John Kennedy's blockade of Cuba. Instead, the president has the hostage families over, pledges that he's going to get their loved ones out safe and sound, which he does, but only after 444 humiliating days. He holds himself up in the White House, another mistake to show that he's working full-time on this, doesn't campaign against Kennedy. And he made himself the hostage in the White House. He caused more press attention to it. Walter Cronkite ends every news program, day 103, day 205, day 307 of the hostage crisis. It was like a drop of poison every day. And then the straw that broke the camel's back, the failed rescue mission at Desert One. People again say it's Carter's weakness. He should have had more helicopters. Not true. The military wanted 6. Carter added 2 more for insurance. That was the maximum they could fit under an aircraft carrier and avoid Soviet reconnaissance. It failed because everything that could go wrong did go wrong, including dust storms, but most fundamentally because, believe it or not, there was no joint military command for the 4 military services that had to cooperate. And when the rotor blade of one of the helicopters hit the C-130 cargo plane full of fuel to get the helicopters into Tehran, it burst into flames. 8 servicemen died, and it engulfed our administration as well. So again, we'll conclude. I'll get some questions where I can talk more about Carter as a politician and Ted Kennedy. I'm not nominating Jimmy Carter for Mount Rushmore in this book. I am suggesting he belongs in the foothills with other presidents who have made their country and the world a better place. Thank you, and again, I'll look forward to the questions.
I started out taking notes, and then I realized I was checking off the questions I was going to ask because he answered them. Amazing, right? You would think I would learn, having spent time with President Carter myself, that they're well read and take copious notes, as you can see. So just a few things. You talked a lot already. Could you speak more to President Carter's foresight? We have one of the solar panels that he put on the White House in our library, and people are always shocked to see it. So early to think about solar panels. You talked about the diversity in women and people of color that he appointed. What other things can you think of? There's healthcare. I don't think many people know that there was a universal healthcare policy that President Carter and his team were trying to implement as well. So could you just speak to some of the things that he's done that were really before your time during those years?
So I'll mention that, and then I'd like to get into Carter as a politician and as a person, because I think it's very important to understand that. I do want to recognize, by the way, a cousin, Harriet and Jeff Brand, who are here. International Refugee Week is going to be coming. And just contrast that with what we have today. 1975, you remember the famous picture of the U.S. helicopter leaving the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, people hanging on. So the North Vietnamese take over the whole country, and anybody connected with the South, directly or indirectly, is, to say the least, at risk. There's an enormous outflow in the South China Sea of boat people, the original boat people, and they're sinking in their craft. Mondale, in what was his finest hour, calls an international convention, reminds people of the Avion Conference in '38 under Roosevelt, where Jews were, their death sentence came then when no country would lift its immigration quotas. And he says that specifically, and we ended up taking 500,000 Vietnamese into this country. Carter orders the Navy, which didn't want to do it, to pick the people up from the boats. So at a time when immigration and refugees are so controversial, this is something to remember. Now, this gets me to, and again, I want to talk about Carter as a politician, and then hopefully get into the Ted Kennedy issue, which we have to do at this library. So Carter's great strength was also his great weakness. He was a ferocious campaigner, but he believed that once you were in the Oval Office, you parked politics at the Oval Office door and you did, quote unquote, the right thing. And that's why he was able to do so many of the things I mentioned that were politically unpopular. Panama was terrible. I mean, Roosevelt begged him not to do it. And the Middle East and energy. These were all political losers. But it was also a weakness because a president is not just commander-in-chief. He has to be politician-in-chief. He has to nurture his base. He has to keep his party behind him, something that Trump does very well. And Carter lost his party. He ended up being too conservative for the liberals and too liberal for the conservatives. And so when Ted Kennedy ran against him, it's again one of those eyes, inter-party warfare. And permit me just to talk a minute about this, because it's a very important piece of the book, and one could hardly not talk about it when Ted's papers are here, when he's got an institute a stone's throw from here. But if you want to go into something else first,
No, I'd like you, let's lead into, talk about the health care policies that President Carter was.
The health care policy is at the center of Ted's run. Yeah. So I want to say, by the way, that I'm the only Carter aide Ted asked to be interviewed for his archives. Okay, so here's the story. Ted Kennedy had one of the highest support rankings of any senator for our legislation. We wouldn't have gotten airline deregulation passed without him. After the election, we win 6 states and the District of Columbia. Ted calls up and says, Stu, there's a vacancy on the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston. You know what Stephen Breyer has done working with you and the president on airline deregulation, a professor at Harvard. And I said, Ted, the only problem is there are 2 insurmountable hurdles. What are those? I said, the first is Carter has no love lost because you ran against him. And he said, I know, that's why I'm calling you and not the president. He said, what's the other one? Think of Merrick Garland. He says, I said, Ted, we lost the Senate. Strom Thurmond's going to be the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Why wouldn't he wait 2.5 months till Reagan's in office and appoint a conservative? You take care of Carter, I'll take care of Strom. I go into Carter with one of my legal people. I got 10 reasons why you should appoint Steve. I said, don't ask me who asked, but you should appoint him. You remember what he's done? Yep, it'll be a tribute. Okay. Call Ted. I've done my part. How about yours? Strom's in my pocket. I said, how is that? You guys are at political opposites. He said, well, Steve has breakfast every morning with Emory Sneeden. They work things out on a bipartisan basis. Ted Kennedy was incredible. We had nominated Steve to the First Circuit. He wouldn't be on the Supreme Court without it. He passed unanimously in a lame duck session with a lame duck president. Okay, now, Ted's #1 goal from the day he came into the Senate to the day he died was health care, national health insurance. He had gone through so many iterations, Kennedy Mills, Kennedy Corman, etc. We pledged to support health care in the '76 campaign, but Carter didn't want that to be the first thing out of the box because it was so difficult and so complex and so costly. So we negotiated with Ted for 2 years. I personally negotiated with him for weeks in his Senate, in his Capitol office, and we reached an agreement on a multi-phased program. Ted moved off of his single-payer, sound familiar, single-payer program, and accepted our concept of employer-paid premiums, an expansion of Medicaid covering young kids and the elderly, almost exactly what Obamacare is. And we agreed that it would be phased in. Ted agreed to the entire thing. And then at the last second, labor put pressure on him to take a single payer. It collapsed. 20 years later, it took 20 years to get health insurance. And he said to one of his aides, and I quote her in the book, after another failed attempt, "Where's the Carter bill when we really need it?" Now, you have to understand the intensity of the opposition that Ted brought to this challenge. We beat him 2-1 in delegates going into the convention. He tried to get the Rules Committee to support a so-called open convention, meaning that the delegates who were pledged to abide by the results of their primaries and caucuses would be open to vote for whoever they wanted. The chairman of the Rules Committee was Senator Danny Inouye, who had representing Hawaii, Japanese American, family interred in California during the war, loses an arm in Italy fighting in the war. And he says to us after the Rules Committee, "This is the most angry, sweat-laden meeting I've been in since the war. There are over 50 minority planks, including health insurance, on the floor of the convention. Instead of reconciling after the convention, he gives this speech, stealing the soul of the convention, a dream will never die. He doesn't give the traditional handshake. And so we went into the general election hobbled with a divided party. Would we have lost anyway? Maybe. Maybe because of Iran, maybe because of inflation. But I can tell you that we were substantially weakened. It's something I've never understood. Ted and I had a great relationship through it all and afterward, but it's something that history has to explain.
So you talked about President Carter as a politician and versus himself, how he normally is with his value system. The two are kind of one and the same. He's a very humble person, he has a strong value system, and he leads in what he believes. If he's able to unite global leaders, what was the challenge with uniting within the
That's
party?
a really good question. I mean, he did so much better in international affairs, not just Camp David, not just China, but so many other major achievements abroad that I mentioned in the book, including what's known by a Harvard professor, by the way, Robert Putnam from the Kennedy School, as the single best economic summit in history, the Bonn Summit, where we got all the countries to agree to stimulate their economies, we got the trade round done and so forth. So what was the difference?
Right.
And the difference goes to Carter, and again, it's his uniqueness, his strength, and his weakness. There's a very strong moral streak. One of the things the president has to do is when he proposes legislation, and if he's lucky gets half of it back, say it's the best thing since sliced bread. As Bob Strauss once said, making lemonade out of a lemon. Carter never could do that. He would always focus on what hadn't been done. Compromise was very difficult. He had a strong morality. He saw something that needed to be done. He proposed something. And when other people didn't see it that way and they wanted a local dam built or a highway or a bridge in return for a vote, it rankled the hell out of him. and he had difficulty doing it. Again, it's a highly political office, and you have to be willing to do it. Notwithstanding that, because of his vision and because of his determination, we got 70% passed. But it always was done in a difficult and almost ugly fashion, with it making look like he was being dragged to the altar rather than dragging the members of Congress there.
So talk about his first 100 days as president. He basically reorganized several, if not all, departments in many ways. What was the struggle with that? If you're saying that his morality is sort of his weakness, right, and there's challenges with that, is that part of the 100 days of his?
So he made a very critical decision. On December 9th, 1976, after the election, during the transition, before he's inaugurated, he misread the lessons of Watergate. H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff. He was awful. He kept everybody away. He isolated Nixon, and Carter said, I'm not going to have that. And so he allowed 5 or 6 of his top aides, myself included, to have equal access to him with no chief of staff. And it was called, after Jack Kennedy, that's the way Kennedy initially organized his White House, called the spokes of the wheel, with the president at the center and 5 or 6 spokes. Okay, now, Ford had tried to do the same thing. He was a congressman. He comes into the office after the resignation, and he organizes it the same way. And I have, in my interview with Dick Cheney, a disaster. Chaos, nobody setting priorities. And after a couple of months, he appoints first Rumsfeld and Cheney as chief of staff to bring order, to bring priorities. And Cheney says that after they lost, the Ford White House staff does a roast for him, and they give him as a going away present a huge plaque with a broken bicycle wheel saying, don't do the spokes of the wheel. And he leaves it in Ham Jordan's office when Carter comes in with a note saying, don't repeat our mistakes. We did. Yeah. And so the problem with the first 100 days is there weren't any priorities. There was welfare reform, tax reform, reorganization, Panama, the SALT nuclear treaty, energy legislation. Too much for Congress to digest. No priorities were set. I mean, Tip O'Neill, of course, from Boston, would beg him at the leadership breakfasts, tell us what your priorities are. Give it. We can't handle all of this. So that's another thing. We got so much back, but compared to what we brought in, it looked like it was, you know, chicken feed. It wasn't. It was huge. But we just proposed too much. And again, it was a serious mistake. It was 2.5 years before he appointed a chief of staff.
Yeah. They also say that he reads everything, and I can attest to that. He reads a lot. And when you're president and don't have a chief of staff, that's not consumable.
No, you have nobody to, I mean, look, Carter, like I did, took the Evelyn Woods reading dynamics course. He was a speed reader, and he is a speed reader. He has a voracious interest in everything. And it was a fault, for sure. It was a fault, for sure, that he would take our decision memoranda, which I would help prepare, and he would always ask for the appendices behind and more information. He would bring back some of my memos with misspellings and punctuation marks. And, you know, I used to think that it was terrible for a president to get too much information. Now, I think it's a lot better than getting no information.
To this day, he still does that. He corrects memos. I've had one of those typos circled on me before. So let's go back all the way to the '76 campaign. Did you work on that campaign, or did you
Yes, so this is a good example I did. It's a good example to young people and maybe to all of us that sometimes you should follow your heart and not your head. So I graduated from Harvard Law School. I go into the Johnson White House for a year. I left because he decided not to run for re-election. My office is next to Humphrey's office in the executive office building. I knew the Humphrey staff. I joined Humphrey's staff as his research director from the first to the last day against Nixon. He loses. I go back to Atlanta, clerk for a federal judge, and I make a beeline for the office of Carl Sanders, who had been the governor before, had parlayed that into a very successful law practice. I come in as an Atlanta native and so forth, and I said, you know, Governor, he couldn't succeed himself immediately under the Georgia Constitution, but he could run for a second term after 4 years. So he was the odds-on favorite. And I said, look, I'm an Atlanta native, a high school All-American, Grady High School, and Harvard Law School, and the White House, and Humphrey, and all of that, and I'd like to volunteer for your campaign staff when you formally announce. And, you know, he sort of gave a nod, and, you know, what did he need me for? He was the odds-on favorite. He had all the money, sumptuous law office, double-breasted suit. And then my high school classmate, Henry Bauer, says, you ought to go see this state senator who's running for governor. He's lost once in '66. He's running again. And I said, no, I can't do it. I mean, I've already committed to Carl Sanders, and he bugs me so much that I go to see Carter at an office building right opposite the federal courthouse in Atlanta, and it's the exact opposite of this sumptuous law office. There is, I'm not exaggerating, there is a aluminum folding table with 2 folding chairs, and Carter, not in a tie and sumptuous suit, but in work boots with khaki slacks and a work shirt, and he starts talking to me, and I am entranced. Not just because he's handsome, but because here's someone from the deepest part of the Deep South. You have to go to Plains, Georgia, this gnat-infested place of 500 people to understand. No traffic lights then or now. But he understands urban issues. He's going to come out as gubernatorial candidate in favor of mass transit for Atlanta, in favor of reorganizing the state government, in favor of education, and this was the key thing for me, in favor of civil rights. Yep. At his inauguration, he says, the time for discrimination is over. Still, I felt, okay, I got a commitment to Sanders. He calls me back a second time, and then, again, I followed my heart and not my head, because my head would have said, go with the favorite. I became his policy director as gubernatorial candidate, his policy director as president, his domestic advisor after that. So, again, sometimes you should follow your instincts and your heart and not your head.
What things were different about that governor campaign versus running for president? What did he change in any way?
He had to change because when he ran for governor, he went to every one of the 159 counties. Georgia is the second largest state geographically east of the Mississippi. Every single state. Tireless campaigner. Now, that also was true when he ran for president, but with some important exceptions. Ham Jordan wrote a 74-page, single-space memorandum of how to take this unknown Georgia governor and make him president. He goes on What's My Line? Okay? Remember the program, What's My Line? And nobody guesses that he's the governor of Georgia. So, I mean, he starts with zero name recognition. He spends 100 days campaigning before the Iowa caucuses, understanding, as Ham did and the other candidates who better known didn't, that if you win that caucus, it's a catapult for New Hampshire. And you know how we won the caucus beside 100 votes? 100 times there. Because every president who's successful understands the mood of the public at that moment. It may be different 4 years before and 4 years hence. And he understood that even Democratic voters didn't want a renewed Great Society. They wanted to remove the stain of Watergate. They wanted an outsider of high morals and ethics. Okay, then We win with 27% of the vote in Iowa. Bai, who just died, unfortunately, a great man, 13%, Mo Udall, 10%, undecided, 60%. Headline, Carter wins Iowa. And then it was on to New Hampshire and so forth. But when you're running for president, you cannot go everywhere. You've got to start speaking more broadly. You've got to pick your places. You've got to pick your issues. And you've got to pick your message. If the message is too diffuse, you lose. We had 3 debates with Ford, and those were decisive, particularly the second debate on foreign policy, where Carter, the supposed novice against a 25-year veteran, Gerald Ford, and Ford is asked the basic question by Max Frankel from the New York Times, Mr. President, some of your top aides seem to talk about the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Says Ford, the Soviets don't occupy Eastern Europe. They don't control Eastern Europe. That was decisive. Carter turns and says, tell that to the Czech Americans and the Hungarian Americans and the people whose families are behind the Iron Curtain. It took away all of Ford's advantage. And it was very decisive. Now, one last thing. We come out of the Democratic Convention with a 30-point lead over Ford. 30-point lead. Okay, it was inflated a little bit in the sense that, after conventions you get a boost, but 30%, we lost all but a half of 1%. Why? And this is decisive for him going into the White House. He campaigned as an outsider, as a new Democrat, as a different Democrat, and when he gets the nomination in New York, and all the barnacles of the party, the labor movement and all the others, latch onto him, and he starts to take on those, he becomes like a traditional Democrat. He called it in one of the interviews that I had an albatross around his neck. And so he was never quite comfortable in the skin of a traditional Democrat, as Ted was, of course.
Yeah, I can see that. I think part of that campaign was a family affair. His sons campaigned, Mrs.
Well,
Carter
you had the Peanut
campaigned.
Brigade. You had Dot Pageant with the Peanut Brigade going into New Hampshire with hundreds of people and his family going.
There's some serious differences between then and now. I think about President Carter's relationship with Ford was very amicable. How much do you think it cost for him to campaign for president?
So Carter spent, and Ford, under the checkoff system then in place, $20 million. $20 million for a presidential campaign. I mean, you can't run the first week of a congressional campaign for $20 million. It's changed so much with the money in politics. I do want to give you one anecdote from the campaign, because my book really has wonderful profiles of people who could kind of out of a Shakespearean play the sort of heroic and the tragic and the humorous and the villainous. And one who you have to understand Jimmy Carter is his mother, Miss Lillian. So in her 20s, she's a registered nurse.
Mm-hmm.
She takes care of black and white patients, never done at that time, gets paid in chickens and vegetables. At age 68, goes into the Peace Corps in India and has a luminescent smile. And she becomes, of course, during his campaign in 76, one of his chief supporters. So a reporter comes down from New York to quiz her about her son's slogan, "I'll never lie to you." And this New York reporter comes to the plains and says, "Now come on, Miss Lillian, you must know as his mother that he must have lied all the time growing up." "Honey, he told white lies all the time." "Well, what do you mean by a white lie, Miss Lillian?" "Well, you know how I said it was wonderful to have you down here from New York to Plains? That was a white lie."
So I have a poster in my office from the campaign, and it says, there's a simple and effective way for public officials to regain public trust, and that's to be trustworthy. And you talked a lot about President Carter's morality. We know that he's very connected to his family, and he that transcends into his leadership. Can you say a little bit, before we open it up for questions from the audience, about the boat lift in 1980, a little bit more, how that speaks to his humanitarianness, his civil rights, that's his legacy, even through the Carter Center, his desire for people to have housing and food and just basic needs and a place to rebuild their lives, right?
Yes, and this also, we can talk about it perhaps in questions in the audience or hear about the Palestinian issue too. So here's again, someone coming from the most conservative part of the Deep South. His playmates, but not his classmates, were African Americans. Sumter County is 2/3 black. So he would play stickball with them, and then they would go their separate ways. And he told me in one of the interviews that one of the formative things for him is that he goes into the Navy, into the nuclear Navy. The only major argument he and Rosalind had, I think, in 72 years, after his father contracts cancer, he decides to leave a very promising career as a nuclear submarine officer and come back to this little hamlet. It's the last thing that Rosalind wanted. And his first elected office is to the Sumter County Board of Education, and he tells me this anecdote. He starts to make, this is during a separate but equal period, right? Separate but equal schools. So he starts touring the black schools in Sumter County. And he says, I find, first, the black students have either no books or just broken and discarded books. And second, the desks that teenage high school students are supposed to sit at are for 5-year-olds. It was really something emblazoned in his mind. It's again why he said when he was in his inaugural speech as governor, the time for discrimination is over. It's why he became a great civil rights champion as president, supporting affirmative action against his southern base. I mean, against his southern base.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this to me was one of the most important. And then you mentioned again the boat lift and the human rights campaign. It was all part of this. Human rights to him were the foreign policy equivalent of civil rights at home. Just that direct equation. Now look, there were times you couldn't apply human rights abroad. We gave the Shah largely a pass. We did. I mean, you can't apply it everywhere in every occasion.
Right.
But it was a centerpiece of his foreign policy. And again, for him, it was the opposite. And that's, we can talk about this longer. This is where his view on the Palestinians come.
Yeah. Are there mics? Yes. So I'm sure there's some questions, although he answered probably most of them already. He's very good at that. There are some mics, I think, in the aisle. It's hard to see. Oh, yep, mics in the aisle. So if anybody has a question, this is a good time.
If there are no questions, I'm leaving right now. I mean, there got to be questions. Okay.
I have one.
Yes,
Is this,
it's on.
so I just had a question about another humanitarian, Eleanor Roosevelt, who in 1977, if I'm correct, he made Valkill into a national park, the only national park dedicated to a first lady. I wanted to find out what the background was for that and how it all transpired.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt really came through Rosalind, because Rosalind emulated her role as First Lady for hers. And here again, I have a long profile of Rosalind. She was so shy when he was first running for governor, she literally could not speak on a podium. And she comes into the White House and she blossoms like a beautiful flower. She becomes only the second First Lady next to Eleanor Roosevelt to testify in Congress on her own bill, which she drafted, the Community Mental Health Bill. She attends cabinet meetings. She becomes a political partner of the president, like Eleanor was for FDR. So it was really her relationship with Eleanor's memory. And one of the reasons why Carter was such a feminist, and I use that term advisedly in terms of appointing women and so forth, to non-traditional positions, like Assistant Secretary of Defense, okay, was in part because of Roosevelt. And this is what, it bothers me so much. Look, I've told you very frankly his limitations as a politician. But he was a great man in his vision, and his party abandoned him as well as he not getting his party together. So this goes to the women and to Eleanor Roosevelt. He appoints all these women. He appoints the first presidential commission on the status of women, headed by Bella Abzug. Remember her? And she walks off the commission because he's not funding some of the social programs enough, and campaigns against them. Labor, we raise the minimum wage. We create 10 million jobs. He comes from a right-to-work, non-union state, and he supports labor law reform to make it easier to organize. We have jobs programs, youth employment programs. Labor backs Kennedy and not us. Same with the Jewish community. Camp David and the peace. We break the back of the Arab boycott. He's the father of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the father of the museum, through the Presidential Commission. Soviet Jewish immigration. And the only good thing to come out of Iran, beside finally getting the hostages out, we saved 50,000 Iranian Jews, refugees, by bending the visa laws, frankly, and getting them out of Tehran and allowing those who were in and would have been subject to our executive order expelling Iranians in the United States out of the hostage crisis. And yet he gets the lowest percentage of Jewish votes of any Democratic president or candidate in modern times, 40%. For God's sake, McGovern gets 70%. That's, again, another story. But in any event, the point is that Eleanor Roosevelt was a great figure for Rosalind.
I'm so happy you said that. I think Rosalind Carter is probably one of the best first ladies ever. She's the best kept secret in many ways. So
she was, in some respects, a tougher politician. I mean, I mentioned Panama. She said, Jimmy, don't do Panama. It's electric. Every president going back to LBJ has tried to do it, and they've dropped it. Wait till your second term. And he said, suppose I don't have a second term.
she was also good on the campaign trail. They would ask her about her favorite recipes, and she'd say, I'm not here for that. I'm here to talk politics. Ma'am.
I am Dr. Carter by marriage, and I appreciate Jimmy Carter because he's the champion of human rights. I belong to his library and museum in Atlanta, and I don't know if many people know all the things that Jimmy Carter did in favor of the people in Africa. He used his money to build a hospital and other things. Now, you were an advisor. Were you an advisor during the political campaign or after President Carter was elected?
I'm not sure I understood her question.
So is your question?
Is if he was an advisor during the political campaign in 1976.
Were you an advisor in 76 to President Carter?
Yes, the whole time, sure.
Because one of the winning cards.
But I mean, if you're talking about Africa, you're talking about Africa?
I was talking about what he's doing today. What he's
so
doing
I mean,
all
what
over
he's
the
done with
years
the-
after the
sure.
presidency.
So
But what
look-
I'm asking you is, if you were his advisor during his political campaign in 1976,
Yes. Yes.
one of the winning cards, because President Carter has been always against the abuse of people in favor of human rights. One of the winning cards in the last debate with Gerald Ford who is today the only president, was never elected by the Americans, was the question that Carter asked Ford about the involvement of United States with the coup in Chile with Pinochet. Ford didn't know how to get
Ma'am,
no answer.
you've talked a long time, so
So
let me...
is your question,
What is your question?
The question is, are you aware that the reason why one of the winning card for President Carter was because Carter pointed to Ford or asked questions to Ford about the political involvement with the coup in Chile with Pinochet. And Ford didn't know how to answer.
Please.
she's asking about...
Yes, I
she's-
understand. So we took on all the military dictators, Argentina, Chile,
I know that one.
Bolivia, and we cut their arms off, military arms off, because of their repression.
So
So,
my
I'm
work
sorry, ma'am,
calculate-
please. I think in fairness, would you let other people, I don't know what, I don't know really what you're asking, but I can only say he took on the military dictators there, he did it in Africa. I'm not sure what else you're asking.
What I'm saying is that the Carter won the presidency against Gerald Ford.
please
She's
Fine.
saying that he won the, you're saying that he won the presidency because of his global work.
Yes,
Yes.
he was upset about it. He asked a question, and Ford didn't know how to answer any question. He was not aware. And he looked very bad about that one,
I thank you for that. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
because it's the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir. Oh. Sir, right here?
Oh, me?
Yes.
Sorry. There's two things I'd like to say. First off, I am the recipient of socialized health care.
Okay.
You guys pay for my health care. I wish I could pay for yours. And granted, it's the VA, but they treat me wonderfully. They've kept me alive for a long period of time. Now, the thing that I want to ask is, when I see a shadow of a president standing with three people trying to privatize the Veterans Administration, how well do you think this is going to go over with the American people?
Interesting.
Well, I mean, privatizing the VA won't go 1 inch. I mean, it's a very popular program for veterans. It has no chance of being and shouldn't be privatized.
I
And we
agree.
certainly
I
didn't.
agree with you. I just am
I mean,
wondering. And
I can tell you that our VA chief, Max Cleland, was a triple amputee from Vietnam, and we were great supporters of the VA system.
I don't want to say anything bad about Kennedy, but if he had voted on our Carter's side, we would have health care
Well, we would
paid
have had
for
20
children
years
up to
earlier.
12, right?
I agree.
We were gonna expand Medicaid dramatically. We were providing employer-paid insurance. We were expanding the VA. We were gonna cover children and catastrophic health care. And, you know, as Obama has learned, ours is an incremental system. You just can't do everything at once. Yeah. And the VA is important, but thinking that we can have Medicare for all and abandon the whole private insurance system doesn't work either. You have to have a combination of the two.
Would have been nice, though.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you for your question. Sir.
Yep. My question is about nuclear weapons. What was President Carter's concern about nuclear weapons during his administration?
Okay.
And how does he feel about them today?
Okay, so he was a nuclear engineer. He was an officer in a nuclear sub. And years later, when the SS Jimmy Carter was christened in Connecticut at Groton, it was the last Nautilus-class submarine. I went into it for a tour, and I came back and I said to my wife, Fran, I said, it's unbelievable to think that people stay around for 60 to 90 days in this cramped quarter. So he understood nuclear power more than anyone. He had a great concern about nuclear proliferation and negotiated the SALT II nuclear arms reduction treaty with the Soviet Union. So here's again, I want to try to put this in today's terms so you understand how much we've lost from the mentality there. I mentioned already Panama, how we had bipartisan support. Okay, so we're going into 1980. Reagan is opposed to SALT. Still, we have a heavily Democratic Senate. And then there's a founding of a Soviet brigade in Cuba. Here we go back to Jack Kennedy again. This was a secret protocol in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was never made public, that the Soviets would be allowed to keep 2,000 defensive troops in Cuba. This was just their successors. Everybody makes a big deal of it. The Soviets are at our doorstep. SALT doesn't pass. But here's what happens. Reagan comes into office, and for the full term of SALT, 7 years, both the Soviets, Gorbachev, and Reagan abide by that treaty as if it had been ratified. Just look at what happens today. The nuclear agreement with Iran, we pull out of. The agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we pull out of. The INF Treaty, we pull out of. The Paris Peace Accords, we pull out of. I mean, presidents are supposed to, there's a continuity, so foreign governments can trust the word of the United States when we reach a treaty that our successor is going to honor the treaty. Reagan did, to his credit.
So we barely have enough time. So what I'd like to do is hear the last 2 questions, and then you can give short answers to both questions. Can we do it? I'm going to start.
Yes and no.
Can I start? Let me start here because you've been waiting. So, sir, can you give us your question?
Sure. I'd just like to ask, it's a little known fact that the negotiation of the release of the hostages in Iran was actually negotiated by the Carter administration, but it occurred shortly after Ronald Reagan had been inaugurated. What was the final negotiations during the final days of the White House?
Yeah, okay.
So you want to know what the final...
What was the final days of the White
Okay.
House like?
What was that like?
Yeah, what was
Okay.
it like? What was the process the Carter administration went through to negotiate with Iran to get the hostages out? And just a quick final question: what was the Carter administration's reaction to them being released so soon after Carter had been taken out, thus giving the success to Reagan?
Thank you. Sir, question.
I just wanted to mention that I nominated President Carter for the Profile in Courage Award, which is given by this presidential library, because of I believe, the very underestimated presidency that he had. And I believe that everyone in this audience can attest to is his very successful post-presidency.
Tell me your name.
My name is Vincent Bonito, and I am from New Jersey,
thank you
and I'm
very
a
much.
proud Kennedy Democrat.
Thank you.
I do have a quick question, if you could expand.
You knew I was going to ask that, right? Do you have
What-
a question?
What, if any, was the relationship like between President Carter and the late President Reagan, if you please?
So which one would you like to answer first?
Okay, so I'll take the first question first.
Short
Khomeini,
answers.
who was the leader of the Iranian Revolution, hated Jimmy Carter because Carter embodied to him all the presidents who had supported the Shah. We had several agreements to release the hostages with his government, every one of which he vetoed. Now, here is a question, and Gary Sick, who was our Iran expert on National Security Council, wrote a book about this. There were congressional hearings which were inconclusive. How is it that the hostages were released the minute Reagan is sworn in and not before the election or even when we're in the transition? I mean, we reached the agreement. How is it? So, the allegation was made by Gary that the Reagan people went to Khomeini and said to him, don't release the hostages. It will win the election for Carter. And if you don't, you'll get arms. It was the Iran-Contra affair. You'll get arms from us. They were then at war with Iraq. Saddam Hussein had invaded them. That's never been proven. I want to make it absolutely clear it's never been proven. There were congressional hearings about it. What we do know is that his vice presidential running mate, George H.W. Bush, went to Paris during the campaign. I don't know that there are a lot of votes there. His campaign manager went to Mexico. Was this part of a scheme? We don't know.
Okay.
What I do know is this. It made a huge difference. And just imagine this. Two things from the 80 campaign, I have to tell you. We made the huge political mistake of having one debate with Reagan 8 days before the election. Never do that when you're an incumbent. Reagan's a great debater. But in my interview with James Baker for this book, his campaign manager, he admitted that they stole the debate book I prepared for Carter with all of the attack lines and so forth. He said, our campaign manager put the thing on my door about 2 weeks before the campaign and said, Jim, you might want to look at this. And he says to me, I thought for a second, Stu, about whether I'm dealing with stolen goods, but it only took a second to decide I was going to read it. Was it decisive? Maybe not, but I sure would have liked to have had their debate book. But now Iran, okay? So, we lost in a landslide. Before the debate, we're ahead. We lose the debate. But debates have a half-life of a couple of days. So the Saturday before the Tuesday election, I'm not talking about our own internal polls. CBS, NBC have us even and advancing. And it looks like we're going to pull it off. I'm in the Chicago Hilton Hotel at the airport because we're campaigning there. And I get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning. Air Force One is going to leave in 45 minutes. The president's going back to Washington. I said, why are we leaving? The Iranians have made another offer. I begged Carter not to go back. I said, just read the offer. It was a positive step, but not enough. He instead went back. It reignited the whole hostage thing. It was not sufficient, and we dropped like a rock. So what was it like? Every president or presidential campaign does this. The last day of the election, you go east to west to follow the setting sun. And you end up in California. We ended up, in this case, actually in a Boeing hangar in Seattle. They were not making the X-8s, by the way, at that time. And we come back, we get on Air Force One, and Pat Caddell, our pollster, calls and says, it's all over. The Iran thing has come back. We're dropping like a rock. Of course, he tells Carter. Carter comes out. And I have to admit, I'm crying like a baby. I hugged him and I said, we've let you down. And he said, no, you haven't let me down.
So
We land in Warner Robins, go to planes. Mind you, this is the way modern politics are. The first vote hasn't been cast yet, but we knew we lost because of the polls. Rosalind is crying, has to hide herself. It was an extremely emotional way to end a presidency, and that's the way Carter is remembered, for losing overwhelmingly, and that's why I wrote this book, because there's so much that occurred between the time he took the oath of office and the time he left. So much was done that we benefit from today that I want that full picture to be out. I want everyone to hear it and see it.
So yes or no, was there a relationship between Carter and Reagan? Knowing
Okay.
that emotional
The answer is
loss.
no, with one exception, and that is the hostages are released. Reagan is day one of his presidency. In a gracious act, he has Carter go on Air Force One to get the hostages in Germany. Now, interestingly, he and Ford have a bitter campaign. I mean, again, we won by 0.5%, by 30 electoral votes. And there was no relationship there. Two things happened to cause a beautiful relationship to happen. The first is Golda Meir dies, former Prime Minister of Israel, and Reagan asks the three living presidents, I have a picture in my office with the three of them, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, to go on Air Force One. So the seating on Air Force One as they go to Israel is Carter and Ford are sitting next to each other, and then there's an aisle, and Nixon is on the other side. And he's brooding the whole time, and Ford had no great love for him. And Carter and Ford bond during this 12-hour trip back and forth. They did joint things at their presidential libraries, and I created with his domestic advisor, Jim Cannon, something called the American Agenda, which they co-chaired, which had a bipartisan group to give advice to whoever was elected in '88. It was Ford. That was still when bipartisanship was possible. So we went to Beaver Creek, where his place was, went to the Carter Center. They had a beautiful relationship.
So on that note, beautiful relationships with happy thoughts, we're going to end our conversation with Mr. Eizenstat.
Thank you. Talk about books.
They're here. His book is a fabulous read. I love it.
And
it's done with archival materials and
Sign.
his own work, and they're available.
And I'm signing books after.
And
right
he's
after.
signing.